A human body holds its core at about 37 degrees Celsius and has almost no tolerance for drift. Push that core to 40, and the enzymes running your cells start to misfold. Push it to 42, and the proteins in your brain and liver denature the way egg white turns opaque in a hot pan, and that change does not reverse. 5 degrees. That is the entire margin between a working human being and a cooked one, and every ancestor you have ever had lived inside it without a thermostat, without ice, without a single machine that moved air. On the 10th of July, 1913, a thermometer at Furnace Creek in Death Valley registered 56.7 degrees Celsius in the shade. There was almost no shade. A person left standing in air that hot, with no water, would be incoherent within 2 hours and dead before evening. And yet people lived in Death Valley. The Timbisha Shoshone were there long before the thermometer was, and they were not the only ones. Across the Sahara, the Danakil, the Thar, the Nullarbor, the Sonoran, human beings settled into places where the summer air routinely exceeds what an unprotected body can survive, and they stayed. The question this video answers is how, and more precisely what it cost. Because the honest archaeological and ethnographic record of human heat survival is not a story about clever shade structures and clay pots. It runs through blood drunk from a still warm stomach, through infants that were not carried into the next dry season, through neighbors butchered in a drought, through children lowered into a cave to buy rain, and through entire economies built on making somebody else absorb the heat for you. The answers are darker than the problem. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Start with what your body actually does, because the standard answer is that we sweat, and the standard answer is correct as far as it goes. Humans are the best sweaters on the planet. You carry somewhere between 2 and 5 million eccrine glands, distributed across nearly your entire skin surface, and under load they can pour out a liter of water an hour, without much difficulty. Trained endurance athletes in heat have been measured at 2 and even 3 liters an hour. No other large mammal comes close. Dogs pant, which cools the head but does little for the body. Horses sweat, but with far less capacity, and with a foamy secretion that fails in humid air. Antelope and gazelle use a carotid rete, a mesh of blood vessels, that keeps the brain a few degrees cooler than the overheating trunk, which is a way of tolerating hyperthermia rather than escaping it. Peter Wheeler, working at Liverpool John Moores University through the 1980s and early 1990s, built physical models of hominin bodies and measured the solar radiation they absorbed in different postures. A quadruped, in equatorial midday, takes the sun across its whole back. Stand the same animal upright and the exposed area at noon drops sharply, while the head, the part you most need to protect, sits in the smallest possible target zone and catches whatever breeze exists above the hot ground layer. Wheeler calculated that bipedalism plus hair loss could cut the water needed to stay cool by a substantial fraction, on the order of a third or more in open savanna conditions. Nina Jablonski and George Chaplin, in their 2000 paper in the Journal of Human Evolution, tied the other half of the trade together. Once you lose the fur that shielded the skin, you need melanin, and dark pigmentation appears in the human lineage as the price of a cooling system that leaves the skin bare to ultraviolet light. So we became the animal that could work in the sun. Dennis Bramble and Daniel Lieberman argued in their 2004 Nature paper that the whole architecture follows from it. The nuchal ligament that stabilizes the head, the enlarged gluteus maximus, the springy Achilles tendon, a body assembled for moving long distances in heat rather than short distances fast. Then comes the part the tidy version leaves out. Sweat is water, and water is the one thing that cannot be manufactured. A person losing a liter an hour in the Kalahari has maybe 3 hours before performance degrades badly, and perhaps 8 before they are in serious trouble. Nobody in the Pleistocene carried 8 liters. An ostrich eggshell flask holds about a liter. A gut or bladder water skin holds a few. The sweating system that made us superior in heat also made us the most water-hungry primate alive. and it turned every hot afternoon into a countdown with a hard floor. Which brings us to the first genuinely dark thing our ancestors did about heat, which was to use it as a weapon and accept the risk of dying in the attempt. Louis Liebenberg, who has been running with Kalahari trackers since the 1980s, published detailed accounts in Current Anthropology in 2006 of persistence hunts he personally accompanied among the Juhohansi and Gui in Botswana. The method depends entirely on the asymmetry described above. A kudu can outrun a human easily over any short distance. It cannot sweat efficiently, it must stop to pant, and it dumps heat far more slowly than the naked, sweating creature following it. So the hunters chase it in the worst hours of the day, deliberately, at air temperatures Liebenberg logged between 39 and 42 degrees Celsius, keeping it moving until its core climbs past the point of collapse. The chases Liebenberg recorded ran 2 to 5 hours and covered 25 to 35 kilometers. In one hunt in October 2001, a tracker named Karoha Langwane ran down a kudu bull over roughly 5 hours in extreme heat and killed it with a spear, while the animal stood immobile and overheated, unable to run further. Liebenberg described Karoha as being close to collapse himself by then, and this is the part worth sitting with. The hunter is running the same race as the prey. He is betting that his cooling system beats the antelopes by a wide enough margin to survive the difference. Liebenberg documented hunters who had to abandon chases because they ran out of water, and the trackers he worked with were explicit that men had died doing this. The strategy was never safe. It was a calculated exchange of one person's risk of heat stroke against 100 kilograms of meat, taken in the hours when every other predator on the savanna was lying in shade. And it made the water problem worse, not better, because a 5-hour chase in 40-degree heat costs the hunter perhaps 5 liters he does not have, which is why what happens after the kill is so revealing. The first thing opened on a large animal in a dry country is not the muscle, it is the stomach. Ethnographic accounts from the Kalahari, from Hadza country in Tanzania, from the Australian interior, and from the East African pastoralist belt all describe the same practice. The rumen or stomach of a large herbivore holds several liters of warm greenish fluid, and that fluid is drunk. It is filtered through a hand or a grass wad, sometimes squeezed out of the digested vegetation directly, and it tastes exactly as bad as it sounds. It is also mostly water, mildly saline, and available on the spot. Blood is drunk fresh from the neck for the same reason, and among Maasai and Samburu herders, the practice of bleeding a live cow from the jugular and closing the wound afterward is a way of extracting fluid and protein from an animal without killing it. Frank Marlowe, who spent decades with the Hadza, documented how much of their dry season liquid intake arrives through food rather than through drinking, from tubers chewed for their moisture and spat out as a dry wad, from baobab pulp, from the animals themselves. Aboriginal groups in the Australian desert dug up the water-holding frog, Cyclorana platycephala, which spends dry years buried in a cocoon, underground with its bladder swollen with clean water, and squeezed it out into a hand. The frog survives more often than not. In the Sahara and the Arabian interior, travelers' accounts from the 19th and 20th centuries record the last resort, which was to kill a camel and drink the fluid from its stomach, a decision that trades away the only thing capable of carrying you out. There is one more method, the one everybody has heard about, and it is worth being precise because the precision is the grim part. Drinking urine does not work. Human urine under dehydration is concentrated, running up to 1,200 milliosmoles per kilogram against a blood plasma of roughly 290, which means the kidneys must spend more water excreting the salts and urea you just reintroduced than the liquid delivered. Every serious survival physiology text says the same thing, and every military survival manual since the mid-20th century has advised against it. It appears in the historical record anyway, over and over, in shipwreck accounts and desert crossings and siege narratives, because a dying person is not running an osmolality calculation. They are drinking the only wet thing left, now the darkest arithmetic, and it involves children. Infants are worse at heat than adults for hard structural reasons. They have a large surface area relative to their mass, so they absorb heat quickly. Their sweating capacity is immature. They cannot ask for water or walk to it. And in a mobile foraging group, every child under about 4 has to be carried, which is a metabolic tax paid by the mother in the hottest hours of the day. Nancy Howell's demographic work on the Do Kung, published in 1979, established a birth interval of roughly 4 years, and Richard Lee's calculations on the same population showed why. A Kung woman covered something like 2,400 kilometers a year on foraging rounds, carrying a child for much of it. 2 small children at once, in a dry landscape where water sources are far apart, is a physical impossibility for one carrier, and the ethnographic record across desert-dwelling peoples on 3 continents contains the same uncomfortable material as a consequence. Howell and Marjorie Shostak both recorded Kung testimony about infants who were not kept, decisions made at birth and framed by the women themselves in terms of the child already alive and the distance to the next water. Australian Western Desert ethnographies from the early 20th century record the same practice under drought conditions. Demographers treat it as one of the mechanisms holding forager populations below the carrying capacity of a bad year. This was not casual, and it was not cruelty in any sense the people involved would have recognized. It was a group with a fixed water budget deciding how many bodies could be carried between springs. The dark thing about heat is that it does not kill you dramatically. It narrows the number of people a landscape can move. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Everything so far assumes people who can walk away from a bad year. Farming removed that option, and the consequences show up in the archaeological record with a clarity that is hard to look at. In southwestern Colorado, near the confluence of Cowboy Wash and the Mancos River, archaeologists excavated a small ancestral Puebloan settlement, abandoned around 1150 of the Common Era. 3 pit structures held the disarticulated remains of at least 7 people. The bones had been broken to extract marrow, the ends abraded from stirring in a pot, and cut marks matched the butchery patterns used on deer at the same site. In 2000, Richard Marler and colleagues published a paper in Nature reporting an analysis of a human coprolite recovered from one of the hearths. It tested positive for human myoglobin, a muscle protein that does not appear in human feces unless a person has eaten human flesh. A cooking pot at the site tested positive for the same protein on its interior surface. The date matters. Tree ring chronologies from the Colorado Plateau, built up since Andrew Ellicott Douglas began the discipline in the 1920s, show a severe multi-decade drought beginning around 1130 and lasting until roughly 1180, followed by the even more severe drought of the late 13th century that ended Puebloan occupation of the region entirely. Cowboy Wash sits at the beginning of the first one. Christy Turner had already argued through the 1990s, in work that culminated in his 1999 book with Jacqueline Turner, that dozens of sites across the 4 corners showed the same signature. The interpretation is still argued over, whether it was famine, whether it was ritual violence, whether it was terror inflicted by one group on another. What is not argued over is the chemistry. That is what a drought does to a sedentary society. Nobody at Cowboy Wash could walk to the next spring, because the fields were the reason the village existed. The other response to drought is the one that ran through the great agricultural civilizations of the tropics, and it also came out of the ground with children in it. In 1967, workers at Chichen Itza, in the Yucatan, found a chultun, an underground chamber, near the sacred cenote. It contained the remains of more than 100 people. In June 2024, a team led by Rodrigo Barquera at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published a genomic study of 64 of them in Nature. Every single one was male. Most were between 3 and 6 years old. A quarter of them were closely related to another individual in the chamber, and 2 pairs were identical twins. They had been deposited over roughly 5 centuries, with a concentration around 800 of the Common Era, which coincides with the drought interval implicated in the collapse of the southern Maya lowlands. Edward Thompson had dredged the sacred cenote itself between 1904 and 1910, pulling out gold, jade, copal incense, and human bone. The Maya did not throw offerings into a well because they were superstitious in some vague way. A cenote is a hole in the limestone that reaches the water table, and in a karst landscape with no rivers, it is the water. The identical twins are the detail that lands hardest, because the Popol Vuh, the Quiché Maya creation text recorded in the 16th century, is built around the hero twins, who descend into the underworld and return. Barquera's team read the genetics as evidence that the mythology was being enacted literally, with real children, over the water supply, during centuries when the rain failed. The same logic operated in central Mexico. The Templo Mayor project under Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, excavating in Mexico City from 1978, recovered offering 48, a deposit at the corner of the pyramid dedicated to Tlaloc, the rain god. It held the remains of 42 children, most under 6, many with a condition of the skull consistent with severe illness or malnutrition. Spanish and indigenous accounts of the Great Famine of 1450 to 1454, driven by drought and frost, describe both the mass sacrifice of children to Tlaloc and the sale of Aztec citizens into slavery in the wetter lowlands in exchange for maize. Fray Bernardino de Sahagun's informants recorded that the children were expected to cry on the way to the ceremony, and that their tears were the point. None of this cooled anybody down. It is what a society does when the failure of water and the failure of rain have become indistinguishable from the failure of everything, and the only remaining lever appears to be the one that costs the most. Set against all of that, the engineering solutions look almost gentle, though they were built on their own quiet body count. The single most reliable way to escape heat is to go under it. 2 meters down, soil temperature stops tracking the daily swing and settles near the local annual mean. At Matmata in southern Tunisia, Berber communities dug circular pits 7 meters deep into the soft rock and cut rooms horizontally off the sides, producing courtyard houses that hold a stable interior while the surface above passes 45 degrees. In Cappadocia, in central Turkey, the volcanic tuff is soft enough to carve with hand tools and hardens on exposure to air. Derinkuyu, rediscovered in 1963 when a homeowner broke through a wall and found a tunnel behind it, descends at least 8 levels and roughly 60 meters, with ventilation shafts, stables, wine presses, and rolling stone doors. Estimates of its capacity run to the thousands. It was built for defense as much as for climate, but it delivered both. Then there is the Iranian Plateau, where the response to heat was not to hide from it, but to run an industrial process against it. The Qanat is a gently sloping tunnel, driven horizontally into an alluvial fan until it reaches the water table, sometimes for tens of kilometers, tapped by a line of vertical shafts along its length. The Qanat of Gonabad, still delivering water, has a mother well around 300 meters deep and is thought to date to somewhere in the first half of the first millennium, before the Common Era. Water arrives cool, underground, unevaporated, on gravity alone. Feed a Qanat into a Yakhchal, and you get ice in a desert. The Yakhchal is a conical mud brick dome, sometimes 15 meters tall, over a deep pit, insulated with sarouj, a mortar of sand, clay, egg white, lime, goat hair, and ash that resists heat transfer and water penetration. Shallow channels on the shaded north side of a long east-west wall hold thin sheets of water overnight. On a clear desert night, that water loses heat to the open sky by radiation faster than the air can replace it, and it freezes even when the air stays above zero. The ice is broken up before dawn, dropped into the pit, and stacked. Persian sources describe the technique operating by around 400 before the Common Era. Ice was being manufactured, in summer, in a place where summer daytime temperatures routinely exceed 40 degrees, with no energy input at all beyond the night sky. Above ground, the Badgir, the wind catcher, did the rest. A tower open on one or more faces catches the prevailing wind, drives it down a shaft, often across a pool or over damp charcoal, and pushes cooled air into the rooms below, while warm air is drawn out the leeward face. The wind catcher at the Dowlat Abad Garden in Yazd stands about 33 meters and still works. Here is the cost that gets left out of the admiring articles. Qanat digging was among the most dangerous occupations in the pre-modern world. A Muqanni worked by lamplight in a tunnel barely wide enough to kneel in, hauling spoil up a shaft that could be hundreds of meters deep, in unstable alluvium, with the constant possibility of the roof coming down or of striking water and drowning at the face. Persian tradition treated the Muqanni as a man working under a standing sentence, and the ruins of collapsed shafts along old Qanat lines are their record. A city stayed cool because a specific class of men went underground, and a predictable fraction of them did not come back up. That is the pattern that gets darker the closer you look at complex societies. Cooling became something you could purchase, and what you were purchasing was someone else's exposure. Ibn Battuta crossed the Sahara in 1352 and stopped at Tagaza, a salt mining settlement in the middle of the desert in what is now northern Mali. He described a village with no trees, only sand, where the houses and the mosque were built from slabs of rock salt roofed with camel hide, because there was no other material. There was no food. Everything eaten there was carried in by caravan from Sijil Masa and elsewhere, and if a caravan was late, people starved. The salt was cut from the ground in slabs by enslaved workers of the Masufa Berbers, who lived and died in an environment where summer temperatures pass 45 degrees and there is no shade of any kind. Ibn Battuta, who traveled through most of the known world and was hard to impress with hardship, wrote that Tagaza was a village with nothing good in it. The salt went south to Mali, where it traded at extraordinary rates, because salt is what a body in the tropics loses through sweat and must replace or die. Rome ran the same trade at the other end of the temperature scale. Snow was cut from the mountains in winter, packed in straw, carried down by porters, and stored in pits for summer sale. Seneca complained in the 1st century about men who kept snow in cellars and sold it, and about a fashionable clientele who could no longer drink water at its natural temperature. Pliny the Elder, in the Natural History, describes a method attributed to Nero of boiling water first and then chilling the flask in snow, on the reasoning that boiled water was purer, which is one of the very few instances where a Roman luxury habit accidentally sterilized the drink. The chill in that cup was carried down a mountain on a person's back, and underneath the great imperial baths that everyone remembers as monuments to Roman leisure, the hypocaust system had to be fed. The praefurnium, the furnace mouth, ran continuously, and the people feeding it were slaves working next to an open fire in an unventilated space, in a Mediterranean summer, to keep the caldarium hot for people who had come in to escape the day. That inversion is the through line. Every advanced solution to heat that scales, from Roman snow to Persian ice to Saharan salt, works by concentrating the heat exposure onto a defined group of people so that another group does not have to feel it. The technology is real. The distribution is the dark part, and it did not stop being true. For the hardest case, go to the Danakil Depression in the Afar region of Ethiopia. It sits more than 100 meters below sea level at the junction of 3 spreading tectonic plates, and it is the hottest inhabited place on Earth by annual average. Records from the Dalal settlement between 1960 and 1966 give a mean daily maximum of about 41 degrees Celsius and an annual mean around 34. There is essentially no rain. The ground is a salt flat, and the salt flat is the reason anyone is there. For at least 1,000 years, and continuing today, Afar workers have cut slabs of salt from the crust with axes and wooden poles, shaped them into standardized bars called amole, and loaded them onto camels for a caravan that walks for days up to the highlands at Mekelle. The amole functioned as currency across Ethiopia into the 20th century. Workers cut salt through the middle of the day because the crust behaves better warm, drinking constantly, and the camel losses on the route are simply an accepted cost of the trade. The Afar are physiologically ordinary humans. What they have is acclimatization, plus knowledge, plus a water supply chain, and the margin is thin enough that the route is timed around it. That margin has a number now. In 2010, Stephen Sherwood and Matthew Huber published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences identifying a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius as the theoretical limit of human survivability. Wet bulb temperature accounts for humidity, and at 35 wet bulb, sweat cannot evaporate fast enough to remove metabolic heat from a resting body in the shade with unlimited water. Core temperature rises regardless of what you do, and after roughly 6 hours, the outcome is fatal. In 2020, Colin Raymond, Tom Matthews, and Radley Horton published a study in Science Advances showing that the threshold has already been crossed briefly at weather stations in the Persian Gulf and along the Indus Valley, and that the frequency of extreme wet bulb events has roughly doubled since 1979. Which means the persistence hunter and the salt cutter were both operating on the same principle that now sets a hard ceiling on where human beings can live at all, and the ceiling is descending toward populated ground. Your body still carries the whole apparatus. Move to a hot climate, and within 10 to 14 days your plasma volume expands by around 10%. You begin sweating earlier in a heat load and at a higher rate, and your sweat gets markedly less salty as aldosterone signals the sweat glands to reclaim sodium. That is a full physiological retooling, and it happens without instruction. Some of it is fixed even earlier. Work going back to Yakhchals in the 1950s suggested that the proportion of your eccrine glands that ever become functional is largely settled in the first 2 or 3 years of life, according to the climate you spent them in, which means a decision about your heat tolerance was made for you before you could speak. The techniques survived too. Every wilderness heat protocol still says work at night, rest in shade through the middle hours, drink before you are thirsty, replace salt, get below ground if you can. Those are Kalahari rules, and Afar rules, and Puebloan rules, restated. The engineering came back as well. Architects building in the Gulf now install wind catchers, and the passive down-draught towers on modern buildings in Seville and Doha are Badgirs with better computational fluid dynamics behind them. The 2003 European heatwave killed roughly 70,000 people, according to the analysis published by Jean-Marie Robin and colleagues in 2008. Most of them died indoors, in cities with running water, refrigeration, and electricity, in a part of the world where nobody had ever needed to build for heat. They were old, they were alone, and it was August, and the systems that would have kept them alive existed and were simply not pointed at them. Which returns to the fact this whole video has been circling. Human beings solved heat repeatedly and completely, with nothing but observation. They ran down antelope in 42 degrees and drank the contents of its stomach. They cut ice out of a desert night in mud brick domes. They dug water tunnels for 30 kilometers by lamplight and buried the men who dug them. And when none of it was enough, they made decisions at birth and at the mouths of caves that we do not have a comfortable vocabulary for. The knowledge was never the missing piece. What varied in 1150 in Colorado and in 2003 in Paris was who ended up standing in the sun and who did not. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.